Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you to the Foreign Correspondents Club with our speakers today who are not strangers to the club, both of whom have appeared before in recent months to talk to us. The subject today is Aegis offshore, which I assume just means that you pick it up off the destroyer and put it on land. But I think our guest, Mr. Lance Gatling, will be telling us it's a little bit more complicated than that. And also, we have with us too Grant Newsham, who runs the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, to put it all into a context for us. Mr. Gatling, go ahead. For you.
Okay. If the kafun doesn't kill me before I finish speaking, what I'd like to do today is take about 20 minutes to set the situation, the technical situation for Aegis ashore. Why is it important? What are its challenges? What does it mean for Japan? What does it mean for the United States and Europe, actually? Because it's not just a Japanese question. It's also a question regarding how the U.S. and its allies are dealing with a rapidly expanding array of threats from a number of different countries. And in the preparatory room, I won't call it a green room because it's kind of beige like this, we were talking and the question came up is what happens if someone launches an attack with 20 different missiles at the same time? Well, 20 different missiles at the same time posit a whole number of different types of missiles, probably, in the event of anybody except for Russia. If you're going to launch 20 ballistic missiles against Japan or any other place, no country has a single type. They don't have that many operational. They would not put them all into one wave launch like that. The short answer is something's going to get through. Okay. But also at that point you risk a massive retaliation from the United States, whether it's the United States itself is being attacked or whether it's someone attacking one of its allies or even a neutral country because it's such a dangerous, provocative act. But in the event of North Korea, who was here when I did the presentation on North Korean missiles in November of last year? Okay, so you may recall I went over in some detail the differences in the technologies, the type of fuel, where these missiles probably came from. Some of them are, in fact, most of them are old Soviet technology. Some have been modified by the North Koreans. Some have been modified by Lord knows who. I expect that the Western intelligence agencies know. They just don't bother to tell people like me. But the point is, these are a variety of missiles, and some of them can only do certain things. They have certain limited ranges. They have certain altitudes. Some come in one piece. They come in a unitary missile, and it comes in one giant missile, like a Scud. It doesn't come into parts, so it's the size of a Greyhound bus. So it has a radar signature that remains the same for the entire flight. And it's fairly easy to track. Others, if we go over here to the right and to the right on this chart, you see that these others are pretty tall, right? So they're multiple stage, 2, 3-stage missiles, and the warhead, the re-entry vehicle, whatever that is, it re-enters the atmosphere because they go outside the atmosphere and come back in, can be pretty small. And by the time they get into outer space, they're not the size of a Greyhound bus. They're smaller than the half of the table where you're sitting. So the radar reflection is very small. So you need incredibly powerful radars and ways to see this. Only a few ways to see it. You can see the infrared plume from the rocket's exhaust, which once it's in outer space, there's no more rocket exhaust, there's no more plume. So then you're looking at the heat differential between a warhead and deep space, and then you have radars. If anybody figures out a third or fourth way to do this, let me know, because we're going to make a lot of money. So there are only a couple of ways to detect these things, and the bigger and farther they go, the bigger the missile, the smaller the reentry vehicle. As far that goes farther, the more difficult it is to detect over time. And of course, if you have a sophisticated threat like Russia, and increasingly perhaps like North Korea, they're going to put in decoys. So in outer space, an empty Mylar balloon travels just as fast as a re-entry vehicle weighing 1,000 kilograms. So there's no air to create resistance. Once it re-enters the atmosphere, those things strip away very quickly. So they're very different environments that you're looking at for these missiles. So today I'm going to go over the basic technical issues, and then Colonel Newsham is going to put those into a strategic context. I renew your understanding that Japan is in fact in Northeast Asia, and so is the United States. Famously, someone said on landing in Hawaii, the United States is in a Pacific power also. So even if Japan was uninhabited, the United States would be very interested in what's going on here because of Guam, Hawaii, and Canada. Also, you have, of course, the folks in Australia and other places that are very interested in what's going on in North Korea. So almost everything has to overfly Japan to get anywhere. Does that make sense? The North Koreans aren't threatening Beijing. They don't have to overfly anything. Just go straight to Beijing. They're not threatening Moscow. They're looking at their words threaten the United States. The technology is beginning to threaten the United States. So let's take a look at what happens. You have various stages in the evolution of where this thing is going. It comes off. It's big. It's slow. It's very vulnerable in the boost phase, and then the first stage burns up, and as these multiple stages run out of fuel, they're discarded, and then the second stage launches. So if you can accelerate, and there's a smaller rocket that accelerates it more, and there might be a third stage that accelerates it more, and it goes out of the atmosphere at around 100 kilometers or so, and we'll call that outer space. And up there, it starts falling apart intentionally. Bits and pieces are shed so that the warhead can be correctly positioned for re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. And this can be anything from, call it 1,000 kilometers to 10,000 kilometers. So as these environments change very, very rapidly, you need different types of systems to address them in the different environments, if that makes sense. It's like if you're clubbing baby seals, you can use a pretty short stick because they don't do very much. If you're going after adult seals, you better have a rifle or something because they're pretty dangerous. I mean, these big elephant seals, they'll kill you, right? So you have a different weapon, different season, same sort of thing. So in this progression, you have a very different technical challenges in all of those phases. Okay, and like I say, every place that the United States is interested in Asia, and also in Washington, D.C., if you're interested in that, overflies Japan, except for straight up to Washington. East Coast, it doesn't have to overfly Japan, but even then, Japan's very important as a place to provide queuing and early warning. Early warning, so early as in before you can see these missiles in the United States in the lower 48. The Japanese the sensors based in Japan or on Japanese ships in the Sea of Japan or the Pacific, will see those missiles well before they heave into sight of the United States. Now, also, the United States has satellites in geosynchronous orbit, like 30,000 kilometers over the equator, and they're looking down, and they'll spot the flare of the exhaust motor. And that's a very early warning. It's not very accurate, but it says something's coming your way. And you have to understand the difference between targeting and queuing. Okay, so queuing is if I'm sitting here with my friend Grant, and I say, Grant, heads up, look, I don't even look at him. I say, look up to your right, 2 o'clock high. What's he doing? Where's he looking? He's looking. I know where he's looking because he and I are both at pretty much the same place. This is standard language that in the military we kind of have these things. Dead ahead is 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock high is dead overhead. So if I tell him that and I'm sitting here, there's no parallax. There's not a big problem, Most of you could probably figure this out, right? So it's a pretty simple equation for me to tell him, Grant, look up. Now, it's a very different problem if Grant's sitting over in the far end of the room and I tell him there's a ball coming your way. I'm going to throw this wadded up piece of paper at you. You need to look at so and such an angle, and you need to put your glove up there and catch this thing, okay? It's a very, very different equation when I need to know where he's facing. I need to know very accurately where he is, where the target's coming, what it's going to be, and if he's got to get himself up out of the chair and reach up and grab it, I've got to time that and tell him, okay, ready, jump now, raise your hand. You see what I'm saying? So queuing is simply just saying, hey, there's something coming your way, heads up. Targeting is a very different issue. targeting gives me enough information that he can reach up, and at the height of his jump, he can grab that wad of paper. Make sense? Now, if the paper is going to hit him on the head, he doesn't have to move. He can sit right in his chair. So I just described the difference between Aegis, SM3 Block 2A, THAAD, and Patriot. Any questions? Okay, good. So let's go on. So from Japan, from Tokyo, where we're sitting, very close to where we're sitting, to the nearest feasible launch site in North Korea is about, call it 1,100 kilometers, okay? So that's one part of Japan's problem. If people ask, why has Korea got THAAD? Well, Korea, and you try to see my little arrow there, thank you very much. There's no place in South Korea that's more than about 380 kilometers from North Korea. So 2 THAAD batteries, a battery being a firing unit, 2 THAAD batteries can cover all of Korea. End of problem, right? Got it? Simple. Japan is not that way. Japan is a very much a different thing. It's more like I've got the number in here someplace. From Wakanai down to Naha, what is it? 2,500 kilometers. So you cannot cover Japan with a couple of THAAD batteries. You need scores of THAAD batteries to cover Japan. Okay. So there's the difference. The THAADs work well as a point protection. So Aegis Ashore, what is this about? The Aegis, there's no such thing as an Aegis ship. There are a class of ships called the Ticonderoga class, or this. They are destroyers or cruisers with the Aegis combat system on the ship. The Aegis combat system is a vertical launch system. The missiles that go into that, the computers and command and control that tie that all together. Now, it's simply taking that Aegis system out of a ship and putting it into a building. Aegis onshore, ashore, right? So this is what it looks like in Romania. There's a system in Romania, and they're putting it a U.S. facility inside of Romanian military airfield, and it's covering the southern flank of Europe. Okay, so where are these things all working? Remember that I said these engagements. So up here in the upper left, you've got these satellites that actually look at the ascent phase. They're watching for that flare. So they can see volcano eruptions, they can see forest fires. Most of those don't go at 17,000 miles an hour, so it's easy to discriminate with a computer the difference between a forest fire and a missile launch. So the short-range ballistic missiles can be engaged by things like PAC-3, Israeli Arrow, and a THAAD. And so the THAAD has extended range over the Patriot PAC-3, but it's still a relatively short range. It's more or less it's a regional defense. So you could protect the Kansai region with a couple of THAADs. You cannot protect all of Honshu. Make sense? Whereas Aegis is the U.S. Navy's contribution to ballistic missile defense, and it can actually engage a very high-speed, long-range missile either on the way up or on the way down. In the mid-course up into here, you see the GMD. These are massive missiles that the United States has in California and Alaska. In missile land, big missiles are fast missiles. You need a lot of fuel to get burnt up in a big hurry in order to get out to go do your job. Okay, so the speed differential between Patriot, the lower end Patriot missiles are going about Mach 2 to Mach 4. THAAD's going about Mach 4.5. And it's a two-stage missile. And then you get up to the the Aegis PAC-3, Aegis SM3 Block 2A, which I'll show you in a moment. It's going about 6 to 8 Mach. Okay, so that's called VBO, velocity after burnout. When you've used all the fuel, what's left, how fast is it going, that determines how far you can get. Remember, Grant's sitting in the far corner in the chair. Can he get out of the seat? How high can he jump? How fast can he jump? What's his reaction time? How do we plan this ahead? If he can't jump, he can't defend that corner of the room, right? Okay, so this is an evolution. The spiral development, what the U.S. calls a spiral development, where they build something and make it a little bit better, and they continue to put money on it. The United States is going to spend, as part of President Trump's $713 billion in defense, we're going to spend over $4 billion in the further development and the engineering support of existing systems that Japan already has or is considering buying. $4 billion, and that's in addition to probably half a trillion dollars already spent on these systems. So these things don't fix themselves. They're incredibly complex. They have to be maintained. They have to go into service, in and out of service. So there's a series of, I don't know what that is. If I put on my glasses, I could read it. Anyway. Okay, so Japan has some of these missiles in the Congo class, the 4 Congo class ships, and the United States has missiles, some of these missiles on its Aegis type ships. The U.S. has 32 of these ships, so 17 of them are deployed into the Pacific. These are so important that remember the 2 Navy ships that had the wrecks. Wrecks, that's Navy term for collision. Thank you. They had the incidents that were completely self-inflicted, turns out. Those were both Aegis-capable ships. They're in dry dock right now being repaired. They actually deployed a 3rd Aegis ship from the United States from the strategic reserves in order to have ships to cover them. Okay. This is what the SM-3 Block 2A looks like. If you see the little flags, it's a U.S.-Japan parallel. They call it a co-development. It's actually a parallel development because the Japanese said, we'll do this part. U.S. said, we'll do this part. And then the U.S. prime contractor is putting it all together. When the Japanese buy it, they'll buy it from the U.S. contractor that's buying the pieces to integrate them and send them back. Okay. One of the issues is the sheer cost of these things. They're not inexpensive for anyone, but I understand, I've been told that the budget for this is about $30 million per missile. So that's a lot of missile. Why? Okay, the standard, the smaller SM-3 Block 1A and B have this sort of coverage, distances from the surface distance out to almost 800 kilometers, altitude up to about 500 kilometers, bearing in mind that the International Space Station is down here at about 440 kilometers above the Earth. Okay, so it's well outside the atmosphere. Remember I said that's 100 kilometers or so is space, and this goes all the way up to 1,500 kilometers above space. And it's not widely known, but what these things actually do is they go up and they come down on the enemy missile. So the parts are scattered into the atmosphere where they burn up. You remember the big stink when the Russians hit their own weather satellite and they blew it up. Well, it was just stupid because now they've got bits and pieces of this Russian weather satellite. They're going to circle the Earth for the next million years or so. And we got to dodge all those too. So the way this works is it goes above and actually plunges down on that. So the closure accuracy that you've got to have for these things is incredible. So let's say that the target missile is 1 meter in diameter and the SM-3 is about 70 centimeters or less. Okay. For those 2 circles to overlap center to center, you got to get less than 30 inches apart at that range and speed. So how do you do that? You got to have a lot of information. What did we just do? Oh, okay. I'm going to skip this. The basic point here is that there are various levels of various capabilities. Remembering these environments are incredibly different, so you need a different system. No one's been able to develop a single system that can operate in all of these environments. So accuracy. Here's the Imperial Palace. You know, we're down here on the 4 o'clock on this circle. And that's a nuclear weapon that I put on top of the Emperor one day just for fun. So remember that cueing, that the United States would be very interested in this, even if there's nobody in Japan. And this is an X-band radar at the 2 sites in Japan, plus the THAAD radar in South Korea. This is if they have a 500-kilometer range, what they don't. They actually have a 1,000-kilometer range. So this is the cueing that we can get off this THAAD. Now, one of the questions was regarding whether there had been problems with the development. The last developmental firing of this system was, in fact, using a THAAD-type radar. It's called TPY-2, a THAAD X-band radar to provide cueing information for an SM-3 Block 2A that was completely different location. This is very important. Why? Because this radar up in, is that Shariki? Up here in northern Japan is going to be able to see a missile coming towards Tokyo much sooner than this radar down south will be. So if it can provide that cueing information, that's incredibly important, right? So you don't have to wait for it to get in sight. Why? Because it's too late. Once it's in sight, it's too late. You've got to be you have to anticipate where it's coming and go. Years ago, a U.S. ambassador, he gave a presentation here. I was very happy to use most of my words, but he said, if we don't know where it's going, we should shoot it down. Let me tell you, if you don't know where it's going, you're not going to shoot it down. You cannot get within 30 inches of something in outer space at closure speed of Mach 16 without knowing exactly where it's going. That's the whole point. So here, if we add Okinawa, that's what this looks like. So we have complete coverage of Japan with just a couple of sites. Now, what does that look like in Europe? In Europe, they already have Aegis ships. So in order to cover that much of Europe, sorry about Sweden, Norway, and Finland, in order to cover that, you needed 1, 2, 3, 4 Aegis ships scattered around the Mediterranean and what's that, the Black Sea? Right? Okay, if we do it with this new missile, with just 2 ships, we can provide that much coverage. And guess what? If you add Aegis ashore in Poland, which is going in 2018, then you can cover all of that with 2 sites. Okay. Now, if you have 4 ships, you don't have 4 operational ships at any given time. The odds are that you have at least 1 down for maintenance. You're going to have 1 down for training. If you run into, a Surinamese flagged cargo ship and kill half your crew, that one's going down. So you have 1 ship. Now these Aegis ships could probably sit in port in Japan, but trust me, you don't want to be around one of these ships when it fires that missile. So you don't want it sitting at port, people working on it, all of a sudden a hatch flies open and this thing comes out at the speed of heat. You're going to kill a lot of people, and you're not going to make your neighbors happy. Okay, so having those elements ashore at a big facility where they know it's going to happen, they can put up warning and they keep people away from it, that's all good. That's a very simple technical overview of why the difference is important. So what are the issues? The development that it really makes this thing incredibly useful for Japan is not just being able to fire, because the way these work is, the radar illuminates the target, and the radar gets a reflection. So the radar knows where the target is. When the missile launches, it's blind. It can't see anything. So they use the radar to send a very detailed data signal to the missile, and they continually correct the missile onto the target and continue to refine the target solution. So they're tracking. So the radar is actually used as a radio. A radar is a radio. So they put encoded information in there. What has happened was this new missile is going to outrun the range of that radar. So the U.S. wants to update that radar from the Spy 1 to the Spy 6 radar, which have much further range, and then it will be able to close the radio link with the missile. Now remember, this missile goes out, it's flying blind until it leaves the atmosphere, the shroud comes open, and then there are infrared seekers that see, and they're told to look. It's a very narrow field of vision, so it has to know exactly where it is. So that computer that runs the radar and the missile understands exactly what the relationship is between the target and the interceptor that's going up to meet, or actually coming down to meet it. But we just do it this way for simplicity. Coming up to meet it, okay? Because the field of view is like less than looking through that straw. So it's got to know exactly where it is. Now, if I can then move that entire radar capability off to another computer, I've just doubled, 2 times 2, 4 times the value. If you think about what is it, Kurzweil, that talks about the value of a network. All of a sudden you have networked sensors, the value, the capability of those sensors have greatly increased, and also give me redundancy, which is very important in wartime. Sorry. How's that? Go. Hi. Please. Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay, thanks. Is this on so you can hear me? Okay, I'm just going to have 1 slide, and it will be up there for the whole time I'm talking, and that's the only thing I want you to remember at the end of the day, but I'll explain why. I'm told that a few weeks ago, Tanaka Makiko spoke here. or some point? Well, I'm like the American version of Tanaka Makiko. I'm sort of like a broken record, and I'm the guy who always has the the pessimistic outlook on Japan's defense. And what I'm going to do is to provide some context to help you consider the effectiveness of Aegis Ashore. Rather than just focusing on this really splendid anti-missile system, but rather look at the broader picture of Japan's larger defense and get a sense of just how useful it is. And first, one thing to consider is that if you think of Japan's defense, it's like a mesh. If you think of a wire mesh, and it's a combination of different systems, different capabilities that put together should create a barrier that's pretty hard for an enemy to get through. But if you take out a piece of this mesh, you start to have more gaps. And that's always an important thing to remember, because Aegis is just one part of that mesh. But what you see, so even if the Aegis system could hit 100% of the things it shoots at, that's not all Japan needs to defend itself. There's a lot of other gaps that would exist. But what you see with Aegis, I would say, is it's the Japanese preference, or the Japanese government preference, for silver bullets, for magic weapons, when they think of defending Japan. And the idea is, if you buy a certain weapon, all your problems are gone. Most recently, it's the F-35, this stealth aircraft that's going to sweep the skies clean of any enemy who shows up. It used to be Global Hawk for a while. Remember, that was the end of problems all solved. Cruise missiles at one point, and type in the GPS coordinates, hit launch, it goes to North Korea, and everything's fixed. Patriot missiles as well, that was another, you hear this mantra. Most recently, it's strike capability. You hear about strike capability from Japanese officials and politicians, as if you say this incantation enough, all your problems are gone. But to say it is this preference, I say, for silver bullets, magic weapons, and in some quarters, Aegis Ashore seems to fit into that category. And Japan does have a tendency to buy hardware, to buy sort of particularly attractive hardware, and then after that kind of figure out how they might use it, which is getting it a little bit backwards. A few examples. This was a few years ago. I think it was some Japanese officials decided that if 19 submarines were very good for the Japanese Navy, well, 3 more would be even better. So they basically gave the Japanese Navy more submarines, but they forgot something. That was the extra money to pay for them and the extra crewmen to actually put people on these submarines. So it's the hardware is not the end of the day, at the end of the game. You hear a lot recently about Nansei Shoto defense, defending Japan's southern islands. And yes, there are ground self-defense force units that are being put down there with anti-ship missiles. But can these units actually coordinate with the Japanese Navy, with the Japanese Air Force? Do all the sensors that they have, can these talk to each other? Can they talk to the Americans? Some small problems, something to consider. And then you hear, once again, anti-ship missiles. And Japan has very good ones. But what happens as Chinese decoy technology improves? Now, is Japan going to keep spending the money to upgrade and improve their defensive hardware? There often is a tendency on the Japanese side to think that if you buy it, well, that'll take care of you forever, rather than realizing that the upgrade and the maintenance is ongoing, and it takes a whole lot of money. The Patriot missile system, once again, whenever there's a threat from North Korea, the Patriots are put out at Ichigaya and here and there. One should probably hope the North Koreans don't fire twice. One asks, well, how about the war stocks, which is another way of saying, did you buy enough missiles to take care of all the incoming missiles there might be, or did you just buy what came with the system? Sort of like buying a toy at the shop, and it comes with 2 batteries. Well, instead, you might want to buy some backups. And that question of war stocks is one which should get asked more. And it is a shortcoming. Also, there's a tendency in the Japanese side, to think too narrowly about what is required to defend Japan from particular enemies. The Aegis, for example, could be very good against North Korea. And maybe even, but the threat from China, for example, is very different in terms of the scale and in some ways, the technical difficulties of dealing with it. But there's a sense, well, if we have Aegis, it takes care of every possible threat. No, it doesn't. It just requires some clearer thinking. Most recently, it's the F-35B, the one that takes off vertically and lands vertically. And the idea is Japan's going to have its aircraft carrier. And once again, the F-35B put on the Izumo ship, that's, well, problem solved. Not quite. You have to think about what you actually get from a few F-35Bs on a Japanese amphibious ship. Is what else do you need? And there's often that isn't often looked at the way it should be. So really what Japan, I'm still waiting, and I've been watching for a while. I would like to see really a comprehensive, really coherent threat assessment for the threats facing Japan, and then really a defense strategy, and particularly a procurement strategy and a capability development strategy based on those threats, rather than based on buying hardware and then trying to figure out how to use it. It's unfortunate that in some ways, times it seems as though the services themselves, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, decide what they want to buy individually. And then you have the Ministry of Finance weighing in, and I'm not aware that being a Ministry of Finance official gives one a whole lot of military experience or know-how. So you have you can see that there's a few shortcomings. But I don't want to be entirely, well, first I will be entirely negative for a little while longer. But this is why this is up here, okay? Because at the end of the day, and this is where I am just an American Tanaka Makiko, if you're not going to spend the money, you're not serious. There's no other way to put it. You may be well-intentioned, but if you're not going to get out the checkbook, you're not serious. And that is ultimately, I think, Japan's biggest problem. And what this graph shows you is Japan's defense spending from fiscal year 1997 up to 2015. And so you can see at the very end, you're where you were about 20 years earlier. So we often hear it reported that Mr. Abe has increased defense spending. The good question is how much? And so it's increased a little bit from where it is, but still, if you go back in time, you're where you were a long time ago. And there's no other way around it. You need to spend more money. And so you've got a sense of how expensive Aegis systems are, and most of these modern systems. And well, if you're not going to write the checks and you're just going to buy one or two of them in hopes that it frightens off the enemies and maybe even placates the Americans from buying since you bought from them, your overall defense, it really hasn't improved that much. But here's the optimistic part. And that is, if you think back, just say 5 years at these discussions that we're having today, one about the threats facing Japan from North Korea, China, that it's far different. People are more, and officials and sort of politicians are much more forthrightly talking about these threats and even talking about what they should do. And I would suggest that ballistic missile defense, which is what Aegis Ashore is part of, is actually a bright spot, because you've got a track record now of the Japanese Air Force, the Japanese Navy, cooperating with each other and also cooperating with the Americans very effectively. And so I tend to look at it actually as a sign of progress, and you make progress where you can. And with Aegis Ashore, one of the good parts is, I think, that the Japanese Army, as I understand it, the Ground Self-Defense Force, is going to be responsible for operating it. Of course, they're going to have to learn quickly, but I think if you can get the three Japanese services to fully cooperate and be able to operate together on a system, you have addressed one of the fundamental problems facing the Japanese military. So, as I said, this, to me, the Aegis Ashore is in some respects represents a shift, a continuing shift in Japanese thinking. It'd be nice if it went a little faster, because the Chinese are going at a certain rate, which is troubling to say the least. So that's what I wanted to throw out here. When you look at Aegis Ashore, think about the rest of what Japan needs to do to defend itself, and does it have the right combination, that right mesh, the right combinations of systems and capabilities. And also, at the end of the day, you know, are you spending money? And unless that graph, you can find a newer version that really shoots up like an Aegis missile to the right, then at least you got to be somewhat skeptical. So that's just my take on it. So I'm sort of the gloomy guy who never gets invited to things. But the Japanese government never invites me anywhere. But there's a reason. But that's my take on it. And I thank you very much.
We have plenty of time for questions.
Sure.
We'd like to open things up for questions now. We have almost a full hour. If you have questions, just raise your hands. I'll try to see you through these lights. Yes? Any questions?
Can you see? He's right in the light. There's a gentleman right there.
Yeah, okay.
Come on. I think they want you to walk over here.
Siegfried Needle, freelancer from Germany. One question for Ukraine and another one for you, Lance. For Ukraine, I think every time in the newspapers they say the Japanese wants to buy a weapon and increase defense budget to protect against North Korea, but in reality it's not to protect against North Korea, it's protect against China. But in what I understood from you, what you said, this kind of narrow thinking of the Japan Defense Agency or people thinking about it, it's not. It's very different. They buy weapons for defense against North Korea, and they can use it for defense against China. The other question for you, Lance, I think what I learned is the Nodong and these shorter range missiles, they don't need any kind of a warhead shield to protect, or is it and only the longer range missile needed? And what I learned before is that the North Korea they didn't have the technology for the warhead shield. So can you explain this?
Okay, I'll offer a comment first on Sigurd's comment that just to clarify that it strikes me that when one hears Japanese officials, politicians, and even the defense minister talking about the threats to Japan and the specific threat that a given system, a system or fighter aircraft, anti-missile is going to address, is that it seems that every person seems to have a different idea of what the threat is, what threat is intended to be dealt with, and I always have this confusion as to exactly what threat are they talking about, and it seems to vary from person to person. So that's what I'm saying, is there should be some, as I say, a much clearer sense of what the threats are and what a particular system is intended to deal with, but also consider public thinking. You know, public opinion hears Aegis, and all they think is every bad missile that could come to Japan. So there is both the official thinking, official statements, and also the effect it has on public thinking as well, where they, you know, I hear this all the time as, you know, Aegis or Patriot or F-35B, as if, okay, that solves everything. So it just requires some more clarity in thinking and expression.
Okay, if I understood your question correctly, you're actually asking me about something I told you in November regarding heat shielding. So if we look at his question was regarding short-range ballistic missiles. Okay, so these are typically single stage and they don't separate. So they start off, and let's call them the size of a Greyhound bus. And they don't separate, but they also don't go very fast. In relative terms, I mean, compared to street traffic, they're flying. I mean, they're really flying. But to go some 600 kilometers or so does not require tremendous technology for heat protection. Okay, because it's simply not going that fast. So remember, I told you the most important thing in all of this to remember is VBO, velocity after burnout. How fast is the thing going when you run out of fuel? Right. So these military missiles, they're not built for comfort. They're built for speed. So there's no passengers, there's no nothing, and they're built to use that fuel efficiently, get out there as efficiently as possible to get range, which means they slam. I mean, they go, but the amount of time they spend in the atmosphere and how fast they're going through the atmosphere is all important. And it's very complex calculations involved, but these relatively simple missiles are in one piece and they go up, so there's no separating heat shroud. There is no shroud. The front of the missile, I mean, it's a shroud, but it doesn't separate. And it also doesn't get that hot because it's not going through the atmosphere that far, that fast. Now, if you go, excuse me, if you go into one of these missiles that might hit Washington, D.C., it goes at a much, much, much higher rate of speed, and it's also in the atmosphere for longer because it comes down through the atmosphere at a very shallow angle. I mean, everybody thinks that missiles fall on your head. They don't. They come over the horizon at about 22.5 degrees off the horizontal. So if you're sitting in the Imperial Palace, you look out and you see the Tanzawa mountain range. It's one of the reasons that the Patriot missiles had to deploy from Iruma. They're out at the edge of the Tanzawa mountain range. They literally can't see the missile coming. The missile from North Korea cannot hit Iruma Air Base because it's kind of masked from the Tanzawa mountains. But it can hit downtown. But it doesn't come through the roof, it comes through the window. So it's going through the atmosphere for a pretty good long time at a high rate of speed. Therefore, the thermal loading is very, very high. It turns out that technically this is one of the more difficult problems with missiles. So getting all of that up into space is hard. It's got to be done correctly. You've got to have a million things that have to go right. There are no spare parts on these. There are no extra, everything weighs. There's no extra paint. There's no extra batteries. Everything is designed just to work, and then it die right before it's shut off. But the reentry is a very complex issue. And that's why I said back in November that I'm not convinced that the North Koreans can do this with a intercontinental ballistic missile. Short-range ballistic missile, yeah. Even the the rebels in Yemen can fire a short-range missile. So it might be warm to the touch, but it's not burning hot. These things, the re-entry temperatures are incredibly high, and it's incredibly bad for electronics. That's a bad combination. High heat and electronics don't go together well. So how do you get your device back inside the atmosphere in one piece? It doesn't burn up, and all of those delicate instruments that are, radars and fusing and repeaters and everything else. How do you keep those shielded? That's a huge issue for a long-range missile. It's not very hard. You could do it with car parts. car electronics for a short-range ballistic missile, because the thermal loading is completely different. That's why I say time and again, these are completely different environments. It's going pretty slow, it's relatively cool, it's one piece, it doesn't hurt, versus when they start, if they build something to threaten the United States. That's why I mentioned in November that there's a lot of emphasis looking at the reentry. Is it a viable reentry vehicle? When they start doing that on a regular basis and testing it, the game has changed. And that's where I would be really concerned myself. I'm not unconcerned now, but if we start seeing indications that they're dropping reentry vehicles into the Pacific Ocean someplace and surviving, then it's time to get pretty concerned, because it's a very different environment. Does that answer your question?
It means that the North Koreans can now use the short-range missile against Japan now.
Oh yeah.
But not the long-range missile against Washington, D.C.
No, I don't think so at all. They're completely, they can get it up there. The question is, can they get it back down in one piece, because of that exact issue with the heat shielding. It's complex. It also makes it much harder to intercept. Why? Because to get to Washington, D.C., it has to be going at a tremendously higher rate of speed. And so the thermal loading and everything else is not linear. It's algorithmic. So the thermal loading, you go twice as fast, you don't have twice the heat, you have a much higher multiple of the heat, and literally you start melting down the electronics, and nothing works right. It's very, very challenging, and this is why carbon fiber materials and things like that are very, very tightly controlled. Certain types of materials are controlled, export controlled. If you call up a Japanese carbon fiber manufacturer today and say, I want a square yard of this cloth, if you ask for the right stuff, the first question they're going to say is, who are you and where is this going? Who are you, where is it going, and why would I go to my government to get an export license to send it to you? And this is why most everybody I know that the technical side is convinced that the North Koreans are they must import this material from around the world, okay? They can't build everything. So this is why the sanctions, I believe, if it dries up their cash, people aren't going to give this stuff to them, okay? Somebody's selling it to them at a huge profit margin, but they're violating all kinds of international law to do that, but they still have to test it, and they have not done that to my knowledge.
Sorry. Could we have the next question, please? Is that why I see a hand raised over? Okay.
Thank you for a presentation, especially very informative, technical, and strategic details. Leo Lin, a graduate student. The question goes for mostly Grant on kind of the strategic aspects of, well, pretty much what's been going on over the past month with proposed talks with Kim and Mr. Trump, as well as the South Koreans and the North Koreans. So where does Japan stand in between all of this? Especially you have Japan pledging for a lot of, I guess, support for defending the United States. And it almost seems like Japan was kind of thrown under the bus by the United States. So I just want to get your views on the strategic aspect of it. Thank you.
Okay, I think there's PhD theses which get written on that topic. It's a big one, but just a couple comments that Japan is, of course, worried about North Korea. But interestingly, and I've been around a little while in Japan, that I've never got the sense that the Americans quite understood just how worried Japan is by North Korea. Maybe they do today, or in recent times, but for a long time it never seemed that the American government quite understood just how worried Japan was. And so, of course, the idea that America might cut a deal with North Korea somehow, it's unsettling to Japan. That's just understood. That's understandable. As for these talks leading to something, sometimes when you do have a quarter century of empirical evidence, you can kind of make a guess as to how it will happen, it will turn out ultimately. And I'm skeptical that any sort of a deal to resolve the matter will be reached if and when Mr. Trump and Kim meet. It's hard for me to imagine that this time it's going to work. The nature of the North Korean regime is such that if it acts any differently than it has been, it's got some real problems. I just don't see it. I see them playing for time, continuing their homework to move the missile and the nuclear programs forward. So I think if at the end of the day that I don't really see that this is going to get worked out, and I don't think that. And when I do hear the expression "throwing Japan under the bus," that is kind of a "woe is me" sort of Japanese view of things. I would suggest that an American, willing to die on behalf of Japan, and there's a lot of Marines, sailors, and airmen, etc., who will. And the American commitment to Japan is pretty solid, that Americans will die. So if there's some short-term sort of unhappiness that Mr. Trump surprised everybody by agreeing to meet with Mr. Kim, I would just suggest the Japanese side may wish to get over that. America's been a very good ally. But one of the things that I think gets too little attention is the nature of the U.S. and ROK relationship. That there is some friction, I think, that is being created by the Moon administration's efforts to somehow placate or work a deal with North Korea. And of course, at the top level, everyone says everything's fine. But I think there is some uncertainty. It's friction. It's not going to destroy the relationship, but that is one potential outcome of all this back and forth with North Korea, particularly involving the United States. So that's just a few observations there.
Yes? We're getting rolling here. Just a minute.
While this gentleman's coming up, I would point out that the concern for North Korea goes back a very long ways. I mentioned in November that when I worked with the self-defense forces as an operation officer, every operations officer that I dealt with had a book, a commercially available book of legislation and Japanese laws and legislations regarding defense. I forget the name of it, but it comes out every year. It's updated, and every single one of them had a copy of this on his desk. And one day I picked up the book of my counterpart and was flipping through it, and I noticed it was tabbed back in the 50s, and I read it and asked him about it. He says, "Oh yeah, it's very famous. We all have to know this." And it was a diet interpolation from 1957 or so, with the chief of the defense agency saying self-defense does not mean sitting waiting for the blow to fall. And it was a question in the diet regarding defense, what Japan would do if the North Koreans launched a missile against Tokyo. And this was then from the 1950s. And under my understanding of the diet interpolations is that they are considered, in fact, the extension of the law and how the administration would deal with such things.
Just one anecdote I'd like to throw in, because I heard it fairly recently from a very respected U.S. professor in America. And this was when the North Koreans shot their first missile that went over Japan. I forget, it was whenever it was a while back, that the Americans actually pressured the Japanese not to do anything. And he had a graduate student there who was, I believe, was either a Japanese official or a self-defense force officer. And the graduate student was angry, and he asked, "Who's your ally?" And that is always, I thought it was a useful anecdote, which does, I think, demonstrate what I was suggesting, that the Japanese have always understood this risk from North Korea. The Americans, I'm not so sure that this isn't a fairly new thing. So.
Christoph Neidhardt, Süddeutsche Zeitung. I have two questions. One for Mr. Gatling. You said that in the very beginning of your talk, you said that some of those old Soviet stuff the North Koreans have is probably modified by someone else than the North Koreans. And you said the Soviet Secret Service or the Russian Secret Service might know, but they don't tell you. I'm sure you have your suspicions. I know another expert, a rocket expert, who believes that these missile tests last year were purposely outsourced by someone else, and that they stopped, and this is maybe even one of the reasons why North Korea has changed course. I assume you know who that thinks. Question to Mr. Newsham, that the incantation problem. Of course, it's very true about Japan relying on incantation. But do you think this is a speciality of the military? I mean, Abenomics is incantation, Womenomics is incantation. I don't see any Japanese politics that is not incantation.
Let me assure you, your assumption is wrong. I have no idea who did these things. I mean, there are only so many countries in the world that have the capability of modifying these rocket engines in the fashion they've done. You could trace them back, which is one of the reasons I mentioned in November, is that the United States and Japan were actually recovering first stage rocket engines from the Sea of Japan when the North Koreans were doing it. When they finally realized, when the North Koreans realized that was what was going on, they put explosive charges in them to destroy them after use, so they would not fall into the ocean. They would be shattered in midair, and the parts would be scattered around. Why? They don't want people to know where those are. And what I said was, I believe I said that the Western intelligence agencies know where this is coming from. Okay. And I would urge folks in North Korea to consider this, that they have gone around every UN sanction, they have gone around international law, the missile technology control regime. They are buying from people on the black market. They are buying people who are stealing from their own governments, from their own companies, selling them, modifying them. And for every time they've done that, there are Western intelligence agencies who have spent billions of dollars to find out who's selling them that stuff. And remember, I said that there are no spare parts on these missiles. Everything has to work. Okay? Everything has to work for its design life, whether it's 90 seconds or sit in a silo for 90 months. It has to work, because when they push that button, when they make a decision to push the button, they're counting on it working. They have no way of being able to test all of that equipment, which has probably been bugged, Easter eggs, induced flaws, contamination. They will never push the button on a single device that has any component from outside of North Korea that they know is actually what the label says it is. Okay, and they should know this, and they should bear this in mind. Why? Because the easiest way to stop a missile attack is what's called left of launch. Before the thing left being the timeline. So if you look to the left of launch, the easiest time to stop a missile is before it's launched. And how do you do that? You can contaminate the fuel. You could sell them carbon fiber material that has intentional flaws in it. There are a million things that have to go right for these missiles to work. Now, who has been helping them? I mean, the common notion is that the Iranians are involved. The question of whether these missile launches were outsourced is a very interesting question. How did it get there? Who's involved? All of that leaves a trail. There are people moving around. There's equipment being moved around. And so if you posit something like an outsourced missile launch, and what he's saying is someone else actually brought their missile and their people to North Korea and used the North Korean to disguise it. It's a strategic deceit. It's great. All of that leaves a track. And all the Western intelligence agencies are looking at this, okay? I think it's naive of anyone to think that people don't know this. And at the right time, then the card will be dealt. But what's to be gained from telling now? In fact, it would be the opposite. You would never want them to know that you have someone who's selling them a fuel pump and you know how to induce a casting flaw in the fuel pump, that it comes apart. You know, it's tested for 5 seconds, and at 5.3 seconds it comes apart. If you go back and think about how complicated it sounds that the Stuxnet went into the Iranian Siemens centrifuge controls, so they overspun the, I mean, how complicated does that sound? That's child's play compared to what you have to do to put together a missile to do this sort of flight. Not the short-range stuff. Like I say, you can do that with auto parts. Japan's commercial electronics, you could do that, except for the guidance system. They've got to have a guidance system. So you can track the early versions. I mean, you can see this Soviet rocket shows up here. The Scud originally went from Soviet Union to Egypt. Egypt sold it to everybody. It showed back up. They modified it. Saddam Hussein modified some. So there are certain technical tracks, and there's no point in reinventing the wheel, because these developments are incredibly expensive. And that's why no one believes, that I know in the business, believes that they did this by themselves. They have an economy the size of New Hampshire. Let me tell you, New Hampshire has some of the biggest U.S. defense contractors going, and no one in New Hampshire could do this, right? British Aerospace employs thousands of people in New Hampshire doing some of the most advanced work in the planet. But they can't do this. They can't begin to do this. So how did they do it? Some of it's homegrown. Some of it is bought. Some of it is stolen. And like I said, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens when they run out of cash reserves and they're not, they're not able to buy any of this stuff. And that's what they have to worry about. They have to worry about every single thing in the supply chain. And this is one of the reasons I'm saying that I say until they start dropping reentry vehicles back into the Pacific and calling the shot. They can't just say, hey, we hit the Pacific, therefore, we did it. No. They got to say, it's going to land here, but they're not going to do that. They probably can't do it, and that's the whole threat. It's threat, counter threat. But if you look, and when he talks about the strike capability, the reason he's talking about the strike capability is left of launch. The easiest time to interdict a missile launch is before it goes off the ground. It's incredibly vulnerable. You could stop the average policeman on the Japanese street. He's got a 9mm or a 38 caliber revolver. Take his revolver if you wanted to do it suicide. You could stand next to that missile, stand as far away as you could get and still hit the missile, shoot it, and it's going to blow up on the launch pad. That's how vulnerable it is, right? And you think about what happens when you hit it with a JDAM, 1,000-pound bomb.
The lady here had a question.
Wait a minute. There's another part.
Okay, I think I have to address the incantation sort of insult that I hurled towards the Japanese government. In fairness, yes, it is an incantation. You hear it, they say, all the time. And I would almost consider that political sloganeering in a way, but it does tend to take on a life of its own, and people do believe it. But at the same time, one has to realize that despite this tendency towards incantation, the Japanese have got a military which has some pretty good niche capabilities, and this didn't spring fully grown from the ground or the ocean. They have developed a sort of a navy that is excellent in terms of the hardware, the ability, the quality of the personnel. The submarine force is one that would raise merry hell for a while with an enemy. Anti-submarine warfare capabilities are excellent. You've got the BMD is another one success story, and these things they didn't just happen. So there has been within the Japanese establishment, both the civilian and the military, I would call it people who know what Japan needs to do and have a sense of it and have quietly gone about doing it. And I would point out, for example, these, what do they call them? Destroyer helicopter carriers, like the Japanese ship Izumo, the Hyuga, which allegedly are intended to carry helicopters to find enemy submarines. But to any marine or sailor who looks at these, it's an amphibious ship. And it can clearly be used for all the things that the Marines and the Navy can use their amphibious ships for. You hear really quite so in the open now. Well, they're going to use the Izumo for they call it an aircraft carrier, or an aircraft platform at least. And once again, the thinking for these ships didn't just happen once Abe took over. It was started a long time ago to get these designed, built, paid for. That this is all done quietly. So while there is, say, a lot of the incantation and sloganeering, at the same time, one does have to realize that the JSDF does have some excellent niche capabilities. But until it actually manages to put all these things together, and so that the three services can cooperate to, say, have a coherent defense of Japan, it will never be the sum. It is not the sum of its parts right yet. So, whilst I do stand by the sloganeering insult or the incantation, at the same time, one has to realize the Japanese could hurt somebody in the right circumstances, and that isn't something that just came about by accident.
The lady here.
Yuri Kageyama with the Associated Press. I just want to ask you, like you said that it was like a mesh and there are big chunks missing. So if Japan were to buy three things, what would they be, the top list? And and how much should the defense budget be? Should it be 10 times that much, 100 times that? Because I think the Japan defense budget is the same as like Great Britain or Germany, right? Even at the low level. But I understand that there are certain dangers that Japan have that Germany doesn't have. And the other question is about the coherent military strategy or defense strategy for Japan. If they really thought about it, maybe they would be better, which is what you're saying. But aren't they kind of put in that situation by the bilateral alliance? Americans, don't want them to become another China, so everything is like strapped in with what the Americans want. So they're kind of just, isn't something going on? I don't know, but isn't something going on? The Americans are telling them, well, just buy this next or buy that next, and then they never have a coherent thing because that's not what we want them to have.
If I asked my mother that, she would answer like that. But no, hey, from heaven. But and I'm not being. They're good questions, and I just want to. My answer is, in terms of the top three things Japan should buy, nothing. I would expand the defense budget I would say, my back of the envelope estimate is 10% increases for 5 years. It probably needs to be more than that, actually, to get up to that sort of that 2% benchmark. But just 10% a year it's a manageable figure. It's about the amount of fraud in a single public works project. If you, someone from Boston would understand exactly what I'm talking about. But it's not much money. And what I would spend it on, and this is where I am serious, and this is, keep in mind, I worked with the Japanese military for a number of years. I would spend it on personnel. The terms of service for the Japanese JIECON, the Japanese Self-Defense Force members, is practically third world. It's horrible. They're not paid enough. Living conditions are bad. And it is simply not a respected profession. If you put the money into terms of service and, as I say, make it a respected profession, that is going to do more for Japan's defense than, I would say, buying any piece of equipment. I think if you did actually buy hardware, say you were to get an extra $10 billion a year and you offered to, we're going to buy 3 pieces of hardware, I think you'd magically find that the price of it increased by about whatever the amount of your increased budget was. I'm sort of half joking, but not much. But Japan has good hardware. It just needs to put it together better and use it better. But once again, I would put it on personnel, and so there's enough money for training, for example. You hear this excuse all the time that, well, we just don't have the money to go train. And it is kind of true. But it is that lack of attention really to the terms of service. So that's where I would put my money. And there are, of course, pieces of equipment that certainly that would be recommended. I'd let Lance weigh in on that actually also. But also I'd say the way it is procured, Japan tends to spend an awful lot more than they should if they went about getting it a certain way. So that'd be my rough figure: 10% a year for 5 years, and even better, make it 15% a year for 5 years. As for Japan being sort of forced, the Japanese military being forced to be the way it is because of something the Americans did, I'm not buying that. Maybe for up to a point, until 25, 30 years ago, when you still had the American World War II generation around that thought if the Japanese had guns, who knows what they would do. But that belief really that's a different Japan. It'd be like worrying about Denmark because the Vikings used to be the terrors of the civilized world. But that has been so long but I think what has built up, and this is my take, and it's also why I never get invited places, is I think it is this pathologic dependence that the Japanese government has developed on the United States for providing defense. And I say pathologic dependence. It's just, if you're getting the equivalent, say, of $25 billion a year in free defense coverage, that's money you can use for something else. And it has always been that out of whack. And when it should have started changing, say, 25 years ago, it didn't. And as a result, you get pretty used to the Americans making up the difference. If there's a missing piece, well, the Americans will take care of it. If we need extra missiles, well, the Americans will bring them. That is, it's an unhealthy sort of dependence, and it creates an imbalance and a sort of an inequality in the relationship that over time, I think, creates friction. Whereas you saw Mr. Trump saying, well, the Japanese don't do enough. And the Japanese say, well, you won't let us do enough, or we do as much as we possibly can. We have a severe fiscal condition, as if we don't. So I think the Japanese can do whatever they want to do. And it would be helpful, I think, if the Americans would sometimes say, look, this is what you've got to do. I think but as long as you're getting this much free defense, it's unlikely that it's hard to break out of that dependency, but some equality in the relationship would be I think would be good. But you will always hear that, and I've mentioned this, is that to Japanese officials is that you'd say, look, you got to do this, or else Americans may not be willing to defend you. And I've actually had it almost with tongue stuck out at me saying, well, Anpo Joyaku, the defense treaty, as if this is a contract that forces the Americans to defend them. Or then you will hear Article 9. We can't do this. And that's like an excuse, I think, for the Japanese not to do anything they don't want to do, more than anything. But really, so that if you get some equality in this relationship, that would be the two, I'd say, principal free countries or democracies in Asia, and if not the world, operating together on a more equal basis. That would be a very good thing to see, in my opinion. So.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for interesting presentation. And my name is Ikubo, associate member here. And my question is that all this expansion of the arm races and so forth concerns not us, but concerns everybody. And what do you think would be the consequences of increasing the budget by 10% for Japanese government? What would happen in, say, 10 years? And I'm asking if there are any organizations in the United States or in Japan really thinking how we spend our budget, defense budget, other than spending on developing killing machines. Is there any effort by anybody to use defense budget otherwise? And that's one question. And the other question is that I hear a lot of frustrations from the guest speakers dealing with Japanese in terms of, negotiating agreement and so forth. And what do you think is behind this Japanese mind not to agree and effectively come to a conclusion or solution regarding issues, yes, military strategies? What really you think would be behind this slowness of coming to a solution, conclusion, agreement, so forth? Thank you.
Why don't you give? I think they've heard enough of me. But
let's take it backwards. I think I can answer the second. I'm not sure I can talk authoritatively about the first. I know I can't talk authoritatively about the second, but I'm going to try anyhow. What's behind it? It goes back to what Colonel Newsham was talking about, is the lack of an overall strategy. So in the United States, you have all these think tanks that sit down and hash out what the strategy is. Now, whether you agree or not, you can be inundated with documents, people trying to affect the strategy in one way or another. And then you have an administration come in, and they have sort of a shadow government of people out of the think tanks or congressional staff that join an administration, and then they take the marching orders from the president, and there are certain documents. And this process is very well laid out. It's modified over time in the United States, and there have been very dramatic changes in how the United States has looked at strategy. If you look at now, for example, the U.S. Army is going to spend a tremendous amount of money on artillery. And they haven't spent any money on artillery for a very long time because they did not see a use for artillery when they were fighting, insurgents in Afghanistan or door to door in Iraq. But now you're going to see the U.S. Army shifting to very long-range fire, accurate fires, billions of dollars spent. And that decision was made at the highest levels of the government. It's very clear, and all the people see it. And whether they agree or not, they can vote out the administration. They can start all over again. But that's clear, and it's going that way. There's no similar body in Japan. Colonel Newsham's associated with Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, and they're one of the few think tanks in Japan that actually look at this sort of issue. Okay. Regarding efficiency of procurement, Japan's system is very inefficient. They're trying very hard to make it more efficient. So typically they have a single-year budget. They're looking now at multiple-year buys. For example, they're up until very recently, and I've lost track because the aircraft is almost as old as I am. They were still buying UH-1 Hueys from Bell. UH-1, early Vietnam era aircraft. They've been modified. They're very capable aircraft. They've been changed. Nothing on the new ones would fit on the old ones, but they were buying like 2 a year. Our plan is to buy 10, maybe. This is literally how they'd go to a company and say, we're going to buy 10, maybe. We're going to buy 2 this year, maybe 2 next year, but there was no way for them to. And this is down to not the Constitution so much, but the basic laws regarding government procurement. So it's literally year by year. Some of you may remember the Yamada Yoko incident. Okay, trading company that was literally taking, and I got involved, and I have proprietary information agreement with my customer, my U.S. customer. But let's say there's this metal rod that holds the hood open on a Bell helicopter, and the U.S. military pays $100 for it. So Yamada Yoko was actually going in and changing the 100. They got so sloppy at the end of it, they were changing it to adding a zero. It's $1,000 metal rod. They were making money at 100, but they were adding that. And so they were also bribing a series of Japan Defense Agency officials, including the one who'd actually set up the new ethics code inside. So I got involved in this, and I took people from the Japan Board of Audit to the United States and introduced them to the top U.S. government think tank regarding procurement and how to make procurement more efficient, training programs, literally gigabytes of data, how to do it, how to do everything. I worked and worked and worked and worked. And at the final meeting I had with the Japan Board of Audit, I said, we're ready to whatever. I'll help you. The U.S. government wants this to happen. We have everybody's behind it. We're going to do it. And I realized at the time that we're just answering some senator's question. we don't have the charter to go ask these questions. We're just responding to an inquiry from a member of the upper house. And that was, as far as they were concerned, that was it. So there's no one in charge of doing that. I don't know how you change that. No one wants transparency. I mean, if you look at, and I think we discussed this earlier, if you look at the decision to move Skiji, it show me the trace of documents and who signed what where and who was in what meeting. All you have to do is audit that to show who did it. Who did it? And no one can do that. I can't certainly do it. The press isn't doing it. I don't know if anybody can do it. Why? Nobody wants it to happen.
We say we did it.
We did it. Well, we all, so the point here is, so Japan spends around 50, depending on the exchange rate. So the exchange rate, you know, US dollar exchange rate's going in favor of the yen. So Japan's close to $60 billion. It's equivalent to, you know, the UK or France or whatever. It varies. They're very close. But what they get for for the yen, what they get for the budget is de minimis in some instances, and it's part of what I call the Japanese strategic syndrome. If everything is important, nothing's important. Okay? So literally you have bootlace manufacturers in Japan going in saying it's very important that we make bootlaces in Japan, and then you have deep spacecraft manufacturers saying the same thing. So who makes that decision? Not my decision. I make a living out of trying to figure out, are they going to buy bootlaces or spacecraft? And but who makes that decision? That's internally, it's completely a Japanese internal decision. But we had one of my company colleagues years ago had a meeting with a neighboring country, South something or another, with the chief of staff, who said our procurement is much less than the Japanese, and we get more bang for the buck than they'll ever get, because they do the analysis and they look at the unit prices, the decisions to make, you know, 500 fuses a year in Japan versus buying from a U.S. manufacturer that makes 10 million. I mean, literally, in some instances, it's like that. So typically the answer is it's a strategic capability for Japan to do that. Well, once again, if everything's important, nothing's important. So that's prioritization, yeah.
I'd like to ask a quick question, if I may, probably for Colonel Newsham. This may not be answerable, actually, but recently I had a tour of Yokota Air Base with a young Air Force friend of mine, and I was struck by how eerily quiet it all was. Hardly seen anybody moving around. Cars were not rolling around. The base is dotted with high-rise barracks that are empty, called for contingencies, and there's no, the flight line was quiet. There's no high-performance aircraft stationed at Yokota. This would seem to be a major staging area if there were a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. Do you have any thoughts on this matter?
Oh, I would just note that if it's an Air Force base there, it's quiet. They're certainly not out doing physical exercise. No, I couldn't resist that. But if something happens, the Yokota will get really busy really quickly. Would be my take. And that's often, you go to Futenma, I remember it was one of the defense ministers, I forget which, not too long ago, who went down there and said, boy, there's nothing going on here. And airfields are kind of like that, actually. And he was, of course, savaged for saying that maybe Futenma wasn't that dangerous. But Yokota, that's you know, you go to a lot of air bases, and that kind of is how it often looks, oddly enough. But to say, when things happen, at that point, everything, you get more stuff, more people, and it turns into a beehive really fast. But you just can't sit waiting for something to happen. So.
I would just add that the tour was not official. I wasn't taken around by any PR people. I was taken around by a friend of mine who was kind enough, because he knew that I met and married my wife on Yokota Air Base, and I wanted to make a nostalgia trip. Yeah. So it's not. I wasn't guided by any PR. Yes.
While he's walking up, I'll add something. I was a strategic planner, and my planning was not only for the defense of Japan, but also the role of U.S. forces in Japan. And don't forget the UN role. The UN, many of these, the 7 UN bases, are actually there under the UN Charter, under the agreement, prosecution of the Korean War, to provide onward staging facilities. And there's probably not any spare room left. Most of you haven't been in Japan long enough to remember all the military hospitals that went back reverted to the Japanese with the promises that the Japanese government would provide an equal number of hospital beds in Japanese facilities, thousands of hospital beds. If you go down and look at White Beach in Okinawa, it looks empty. If you look at pictures from the Korean War, they were literally parking, taking cranes and putting jeeps and trucks on top of warehouses because there was literally no room left at the port. So those facilities are in fact very, very important for surge, and as Colonel Newsham says, that's the aircraft that are stationed there is essentially a C-130 wing, and they fly all over the world in support of missions, but they don't come and go. If they start getting really, really busy, you need to start booking a flight out of Tokyo or something.
Yes, Pete.
Langen, freelancing at the moment. 2015, the former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Wock, he was speaking at the U.S. Army War College and said, we are firing $14 million missiles at $50,000 missiles, and this doesn't make any sense at all. And that was a preamble into a conversation, or rather a speech, about hypervelocity projectiles, or HVPs, and railguns, and the development that was taking place in the US on this technology. Since then, we've had reports that HVPs apparently have been seen on Chinese warships, and that they would be ready for US warships by 2019. Do you have any insights on their development and any thoughts on the solution to this as an anti-missile thing we should be looking at? Thank you.
You think about that stuff.
Not only do I think about this stuff, I'm actually involved in a business and a technology that plays right into this. So it sort of goes back to the question that Siegfried had regarding reentry. It's thermal loading, velocity burnout. So he's exactly right. I'm glad you put that in context. I believe the context was talking about the Israeli Iron Dome, where they've actually gone de minimis anti-missile or anti-rocket capability. They actually went to a plumbing supply company and bought essentially underground construction. They bought seamed stainless steel pipe. So when they fire their rocket, it's as cheap as possible because, you know, interestingly, one of the only times a Patriot was ever fired in anger, they sent a $500,000 Patriot to go knock down a $10,000 drone that some Syrian had sent flying across the Israeli border. So it's just a very business basis of it. If you've got this giant complex missile to deliver a payload, and if you think about, you know, even here on my chart, you've got this giant missile to deliver, so call it 1,000 to 1,200 kilogram payload, all of that work to deliver that. That is the payload. That's the business end of the deal, right? I need to get there. If I can get it in a 40-foot container and put it into Alexandria, Virginia, and blow it up, you know, that's pretty cheap, right? Well, there are different ways, and in fact, your mesh, I would liken your mesh, there has to be depth to the mesh. So the question is, how do you get the payload out there, yet keep the launch vehicle? And that's what essentially we're doing with the railgun. I was on a panel at the Japan CPAC with a member of the upper house, Sato, who's a former ground self-defense force colonel who had a peacekeeping operation in Sudan, I think it was. And he was speaking as a proponent of railguns. But I didn't realize what he was speaking about at the time because we kind of talked at cross purposes for a moment. But for shipboard defense, it makes a lot of sense. You got a big or a stationary defense, right? You got a big place and you get a lot of electrical energy, and you use a railgun that doesn't use powder. It uses electrical charge to accelerate something to a very high rate of speed. But then you go, okay, if I go at a very high rate of speed, then it's going to go very, very long ways, usefully a very, very long ways, maybe 100 kilometers. And all of a sudden, I start looking at the engineering of this, and that 100 kilometers, the thermal loading on that projectile is tremendous. And it goes back to the reentry problem. So I can make a rail gun, and right now the technical challenges are the wear and tear on the rail gun. So the rails tend to fry. Okay, so they've been under development for a very long time, and the U.S. Navy has just shifted a whole bunch of money into another category where they're continuing the acceleration. So the two technologies of lasers and hypervelocity projectiles have a lot of promise. And at some point, they're going to come out. They're completely different. One is just a beam of light. Other one is actually a projectile. Now, if I take that projectile and you think, I've got a projectile that go 100 kilometers and hit something, I got to guide it at 100 kilometers. Go figure that out, right? So the guidance packages have to be very small, very cheap, very thermally protected. It's a huge, huge technical challenge, and I'm involved in a company that's actually working in the guidance solutions for that sort of thing. And the U.S. government has spent, pick a number, a huge amount of money trying to do that. Well, turns out that the good part of that is you can actually fire the same sort of projectiles out of a conventional cannon and get many of the same benefits out of a conventional cannon. So this is kind of a trickle-down effect from the experimentations with hypervelocity projectiles into the real world. Real world being the Japanese now have a few hundred 155 millimeter howitzers. They may be able to fire these hypervelocity projectiles with those guidance systems, and instead of getting maximum 35 kilometer range, maybe they get 60 or 70 kilometer range, which is a big difference if you're getting shot at. You're talking about sitting here and putting a round into a building in Fuchu, if you think about that. So yes. And at the end of it, I've just used a projectile and whatever electricity. If it was a rail gun is an electromotive force gun. It doesn't use gunpowder. So I've used electricity. I have to have a big generator and capacitor to load the electricity up. But maybe I can do it with a conventional howitzer and get almost as much range. Yet I've got to. So now the technical challenge is getting all that guidance package. And there are a lot of people working on this. Now, regarding the Chinese, they have something on a ship. No one knows if it works. No one that I know of believes that they have an effective long-range projectile. But if you start looking at for missile defense, instead of using this is SM3 Block 2A, I've been told that the things are $30 million a piece. So now if I have a $30 million cannon launching $5,000 projectiles, and I can launch them at a high rate of speed, and at the end of that, I've used, $10,000 worth of projectiles, and I've still got my $39 million cannon. I'm way ahead of the game. So that's why, and this goes back to what Grant was saying. He said he called it the latest shiny object. I call it the march of technology. It's going to be something else next. But right, you're at the next step, which is not rockets and not drones. And you go back to a pretty simple equation here. Remember, I talk about left of launch. Right when this thing launches, it's incredibly vulnerable. When a missile takes off, it's incredibly vulnerable. That's why nobody advertises it. But if you go to Tanegashima, when they launch one of the H-2s, they have swept that entire area. They know there's nobody there. Why? I can sit there with a 50 caliber sniper rifle and from probably 2 miles away, hit that rocket, and it'll go off, and it'll take them a year to figure out what happened. And that will be the end of that rocket, $100 million rocket plus whatever it's carrying. So at that launch phase, let's say that I put an F-35 up with an AMRAAM, a modified AMRAAM, air-to-air missile, and I teach it to go chase missiles and not chase a fighter aircraft. All of a sudden, that gets really interesting, and it's pretty cheap. So it's all a matter of cost and effectiveness, but it's not simple, and we don't. I don't know anybody that thinks the Chinese can actually have a guided projectile out of that railgun, and it might last 5 shots and then blow up. That's not good. But as a propaganda ploy, let me tell you, they got some attention when that came out, right?
We're getting pretty close to witching hour. I had one other gentleman over here wanted a question. Then we'll probably have to wrap things up.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Kurt Sieber. I'm an associate member. I have two questions, but relatively short ones. The first one, could you elaborate a little bit more about the testing which is going on? I mean, we heard that, yes, one test has failed in Hawaii, but how is this going to continue? And perhaps can we also have a look at what is the percentage of success in the total testing system? That's one. And number two is, if all this works out, Aegis Ashore, when will it be ready for, or when will it be installed in Japan that it can be really active? Thank you.
You should probably know those. Okay. Okay, the testing in the United States, I mean, there are clearly critics and skeptics, but you can find a tremendous amount of information regarding the test. So the last test that I understood have failed, remember that I said that it was taking cueing from a different radar, not in the same location. So it's not me telling Grant, look up to your, high 2 o'clock and get ready to catch. It's me talking to Grant on the other side of the room, maybe in the next room, next building. We can't even see each other, right? So that was a very advanced test there. In these layered defenses, the whole point of a layered defense, and I would disagree with Grant on one thing. He talked about a net or a mesh. The point of a layered defense is having multiple layers and behind the layers. So in some aspects, the Japanese have multiple layers. They have a U.S. capability, they have an Aegis capability, they have a PAC-3. So the farther away you get, in every environment, these percentages change. So some of these early tests are less than 50% successful. But yet they're backstopped in this instance in Korea, say you're backstopped by the THAAD, which is close to 100% successful. But it's a very different environment for that missile. Very different problem, very different solution. The Patriot PAC-3s, the final defense, it's a point defense. It's a very short range. It has a fairly high success rate. So the doctrine is to fire a ripple. So one goes, and another about 4.5 seconds later, second one goes. Why? In case the first one misses, or there are multiple warheads that weren't discriminated at the beginning. So you can't go out and engage multiple warheads, independently MIRs, independently targeted reentry vehicles, right? The next generation in the United States, this big giant ground-based missile defense is going to have a single rocket carrying a bunch of small warheads, all of which have the computing power of a Cray mainframe, that are going to go out and independently see the target array, decide together, manage the system. So I'm going to attack that one, you get this one, you get this one, and you hang back for anything that gets through. Okay, that's the level of complexity. So it could be 50%. All the way up towards over 90% effectiveness. Now, once again, these are never designed, and people get this all wrong, they are never designed to stop 20 or 30 incoming missiles. The systems were never designed to do that. What they are designed to do is to make the person on the other end of that missile think twice, 3 times, think forever, and never push that button. So we would add, and like I say, I would tell my counterparts in North Korea doing the analysis that they can't trust anything they have in those missiles. If they didn't build it themselves, they can't trust it, because anybody that would sell them that equipment will probably sell out to the United States intelligence agencies and put in a false part or a broken part or whatever. And you know, at some level you have to ask, do the Chinese want these guys to have 100% capability? What happens when they change their mind and start pointing them toward Beijing? Okay, so all of this is about deterrence. Now, in a perfect world, I would disagree with Grant on one thing. If Trump came over and they made a deal to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, I think Japan would go, okay, so now we have to find a new story to buy all this stuff. Okay, so part of that is not incantation. Part of it is puffery. Under U.S. commercial law, you can say I have the best. I have the best of anything, and who's going to say differently? It's a personal opinion. It's puffery. It's not lying. Some of this is international puffery. Some of it is blind man's bluff. Some of it is very, very deadly serious. But once again, it's about deterrence. So they never know when they push that button if it's going to have the desired effect. That's success.
In terms of timing, I've heard 2023, about 5 years is the figure that you hear that Aegis Ashore would be ready to go in Japan, which I always thought 5 years is kind of a long time, but that's what you hear. So.
Yeah, the second Aegis, there are two Aegis Ashore systems now. One is a development system in Hawaii, and it may well go operational because of the North Korean threat. There's an operational system in Romania. The third system is going into Poland later this year. The issue is with the SM-3 Block 2A that the Japanese want to use, its range is farther than the current radar can communicate with that. Okay, so literally it's like you hear the term outdriving your headlights. I was driving too fast for my headlights. I couldn't see where I was going. I had an accident. So remember that this missile flies blind. It needs to be told where to go. This missile is so fast that it's going to outrun the current radar's capability to communicate with. So the U.S. is going to upgrade that radar to the SPY-6, and it's going to be an expensive upgrade. So once again, for the Japanese, it's a question of analysis and how do we spend our money efficiently? What is the decision? Why do we make this decision? They do get a lot of, there's a commercial interest in the Japanese for using this missile because half of the missile is made in Japan, and they want the U.S. to use it. They're going to have to lower the price, I think, for the U.S. to buy a lot of them. But the radar upgrade itself is not going to be inexpensive. Yet, the United States knows that's going to have to be done.
Thank you very much. We'd like to thank our speakers, and as part of our tradition, we'd present each one with a honorary one-year membership in the FCC.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And certainly, if anybody has questions that you don't want to bore everybody with, I'll be glad to try to